Well, welcome everyone. Thank you. This is the first of a series of workshops by the SPROCKET Innovation Hub on systems methods. So the first one is a very gentle introduction into systems methods and systems modeling by Dr. Jeremy Hilton. Jeremy is a co-investigator in our SPROCKET Hub. He's an expert in soft systems methods, and he brings to our hub this expertise in applying this novel combination of various different systems thinking methods to complex social issues. And complex social issues, what we're looking at the SPROCKET Innovation Hub. I know most of you are internal to the SPROCKET Hub, but there are a couple of people that are external to the hub. So in one line, the SPROCKET Innovation Hub looks at tries to improve the lives of children and young people with complex health needs and those that care for them, looking at two key transitions: education transitions, so when they start school, move between primary and secondary school, especially navigating the SEND system, and then hospital to home or the community transition. So this is an interactive session, so feel free to interrupt and make your contributions, and there'll be a survey at the end to ask more formally for your feedback, but also you can get in touch with me at any time if you want. Mehdi, who's here, I believe, or not yet, but anyway, will be also, yes, Mehdi's here. He'll be monitoring the chat while Jeremy is presenting. So, Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just bring up the slideshow. So hopefully you are able to see that.
Yes.
Great. Yes, it is a gentle introduction to this. And as Anna has said, I'd be quite interested to know your thoughts on this and what other topics you'd like covered. If they're slightly outside my expertise into some of the harder methods, then Mehdi, I'm sure, or Nikki will be able to provide some tutorials as well on that. There's no breakout groups, even though it is a workshop, but there will be times when I'm asking you to have a think about something and perhaps give the feedback verbally. I'll give some time for that. And towards the end of the second half, we will have a break part way through. I will be giving you some longer things to try out some of the methods informally by yourselves, not necessarily having to share what your thoughts are. Megan, I think, introduced the fact that she'd been to a very good course by John Clarkson, very much looking at a systems engineering approach to improvement. And I just want to make the point that systems engineering in that context is usually a rigorous approach to building, improving, or implementing major healthcare systems. And really what we're covering here is the early stages of the thinking one needs to go through to make sure that what you're asking for to be engineered, as it were, is what we need. And also our improvements and transfer in Sprocket aren't as large, and we don't have the resource or time to take the full approach that he's talking about, but it is very complementary to that approach. And what I would say at this stage is that systems thinking and systems methods are very broad. There's a large range of them. So you may already have some of your own methods in mind that I may or may not cover, but I'm not saying these are the best ones, but these are the ones that I've found over the years to be most accessible. And they're very much the ones that are part and parcel of what was the systems practitioner apprenticeship scheme before the government pulled the level 7 apprenticeships. So what I want to cover on this is an introduction to it. And you may be surprised that I start off by talking about perceptions and distinctions. And to a certain extent, what you might think of what a system is. We'll talk about what types of systems there are, and we'll talk about mental models as well, because we each have our own mental models, how we see the world. Thinking to more depth, we'll introduce the iceberg model, which some of you may already know. But then finally, some introductory tools and techniques, as I mentioned, for building a shared understanding. And there'll be an opportunity for you to practice a few of those today. But when you get involved in the workshops later on through Sprocket, we'll be using some of these with Work Package 1 in parallel with their existing wonderful techniques they have for the workshops already. So Slightly unusual start. I'm going to play a video now. It won't have sound, but you can imagine the sound once you see the video. And what I want you to think while the video is running is, what do you notice? What stands out to you? So. Any thoughts? Okay.
A couple of things I guess I was thinking is that the things that you see and what you're trying to get from it change, like a different perspective visually that there was as I was watching, and also when you don't have all the information, like I was trying to imagine what the sound might be, for example, but also didn't have that, so relying on my guesswork or what I'd maybe experienced previously to add that element into the picture.
Okay, thanks. Any brief thoughts from anyone else? Okay, so what do you see in the stream? That'd be static view. So yeah, you might have seen the waterfall. You might see some whirlpools and some swirls and backwaters and eddies and water getting caught up, ripples becoming flat water, gentle rapids at the end. Yeah, there's constant movement and ever changing. But then you've got water in many forms. And in the stream bed itself, there are rocks, there's debris, there's carved pools, there's stony shallows, there's rocky banks, earthen and overgrown banks. Again, the stream bed itself is ever changing. It's a constantly changing environment. And I want you to think about that as a metaphor in a way, a metaphor for life. And one thing when we do look at that, we're used to looking at it perhaps as a picture. You take a photograph of something, you just see it as a static photograph. You tend to lose the dynamicism of it, the movement and the changing nature of it. So if you start thinking of the water that's moving, it isn't static. It flows over the rocks, it's disturbed by rocks, it speeds up, slows down, it goes round and round, it's smooth and troubled. But also think in terms of, you could say, water molecules and how they move. Or imagine a pair of corks starting at the top of or a pair of little boats. You might put poo sticks when you put a couple of sticks on and see how they travel down the stream itself. And if you use water as a metaphor for life, perhaps, and consider if you've got two corks as people moving down that life course, fast and energetic in the early stages, perhaps leading to a slowing down later on. What's causing the changes? What's causing things to swell? Perhaps getting caught in the back eddies or bouncing around over rocks. So have a think about looking at the dynamic, the ever-changing nature. Pick a bubble perhaps and follow that bubble down the stream. You can see some are going back against the flow, some are getting caught out on the side. There might be two people start off life together but get separated. One gets caught in the backwater for a long period of time and gets stuck. Another one has a rapid progress. And then gently slowing down later on, thinking all is calm and going to be great. And there you go, there's a few ripples and disturbances, but then, oh, hang on, there's a bit of a rapids later on again. So life changes. You can't actually predict what's going to happen. When you're thinking about it, it's looking at the fact that when we're thinking from a systems point of view, when we're thinking within Sprocket, there's very much a structure in place. Now, the structure relates to process, and it may be in a way, I don't know if you ever thought of quantum physics, when they say you can either measure the speed of a particle or a car, or you can try and position where it is, its location. But you can't do both at the same time. So maybe you're looking at this video in terms of the structure of the stream bed and the process of the flow of water, and how the structure limits or causes changes in behavior. Even though the process carries on, the process might change and it's not consistent for everything. But also you've got an interaction between the two. The structure can also limit what people can do, limit the agency. But likewise, where people do have agency, and water has agency in a way, because the water over time has carved out and changed the stream bed, whether the bed itself or the banks of the stream. So again, it's not static. You can't take that sort of fixed view, but considering things as living systems and ever-changing systems, any way we have of thinking about them from a systems point of view has to be able to consider that. I remember the colleague years ago thinking of, you're trying to engineer or build something, and if it's involving people, to me it equates to taking a beautiful living butterfly, sticking a pin through it and trying to build another one. But what you have lost is that changing nature of what you're trying to achieve, and any innovation or any improvement has to bear in mind that it's not fixed. You've got to incorporate change and change over time, but try and maintain the improvement in that changing nature of the process or procedure. When we're thinking about the transitions, we'll be looking for improvements, but we also need to make sure they're sustainable. So we have to think about what might influence those, what might lead to changes in those. I'm going to try another slide, next one. It's a video clip, so I've actually got to go and sort of click into it, as it were. But look how structure affects movement. Zebra crossing, traffic lights, policemen, highway code, and so on. Let me just speed it up, otherwise it takes far too long. Sorry about this. Doing the 2 screens. There we go. Right. Sorry, I'm fiddling with screens. But you've got the structure of the roads themselves. You've got markings on the road which have a codification for behavior. You've got traffic lights. You can see policemen there guiding traffic. But then again, the structure supports movement of people. But look how the people's movement changes, even though they're broadly following the structure. Not everybody does. There's somebody right in the middle waving their arms. There's someone else taking photographs, but they all clear the roads in time for when the lights change again. So they have agency, but they're also still guided by the structure. But the structure was built by people. So there's a system that's been engineered. In fact, there's many systems that are engineered, whether they're the individual vehicles, they're the traffic flow systems, but you're also looking at legislation and regulation as structures. There are people's thoughts, people's happiness for crossing roads and daring to go in front or behind the traffic. Those are all structures which are actually guiding how people work and how people behave. So let's look at various differences in the types of system and how systems are perceived. We can start off with an engineering view of systems, which is generally equipment focused. Here you've got people who have procured equipment for an operating theatre. Now, these have been built by suppliers or promoted by suppliers to hospitals and others as this is the best kit, it's got everything you need to do. But it's a purely engineering focus. You don't really get involved in how they're actually going to be used. And it's a solution to a requirement that's contractually delivered. Yeah, piece of equipment. It could be a process or an IT system or a new organizational structure, but it's frequently done to an organization or done for an organization. It's transactional. It's delivered against requirements, and they can tick off the requirements as being met and basically say, now pay me. Because the suppliers often can have no effect or change to the organisation itself. They can only supply what they've been contracted to supply. Another way of looking at systems is a socio-technical perspective. So it's actually looking at the systems in that they may find new ways of using equipment or new purposes for which it wasn't fully designed. I'm not sure that's the case in this situation. But again, you procure ambulances and the ambulance equipment, but how it's used and is very different depending upon the skills and expertise of the paramedics using it. But it also has to work or link into other systems. It's how they access and gain entry to hospitals. But also when you're thinking about some of the equipment requires maintaining, the vehicles themselves require periodic maintenance as well. But there's also the ongoing skills development of the paramedics and others. And maybe providing feedback on the equipment they've got and perhaps making improvements to them. So here you've got more of a collaborative arrangement. It's less transactional. And then here you've probably got a new way of working. It's collaboration, sort of co-creation, equipment in use or processes developed with the people who are using them. There's an interaction, there's a feedback, and you're going to get improvement. And certainly the transitions within Sprocket were very much looking at this co-creation, collaboration. So it's going to be very much working with and in fact guided by primarily the children, people and parents and caregivers, but also in coordination and in collaboration with the other service providers, whether they're health services or education or social services, local authorities and so on. The third type of system is very much that social perspective, which is more people focused, a more personal relationship. And I suppose here I have to declare a hobby horse of mine. If we're looking at delivering healthcare, I think that's purveying or conveying a more transactional view rather than caring for people, which actually gives a different emphasis to it. We don't provide treatment, which could be supplying equipment, but we treat. We don't deliver education, we teach. Now you might deliver a lecture if there's no interaction, but once it's interactional, then I think delivery is actually the wrong word, because we have to bear in mind that the words we use tends to lead to the behaviors we undertake. So words are really quite important, certainly when we're describing things and trying to share what we're thinking. So what we're looking at here, certainly when you've got people involved with equipment or people with people, you're looking at very complex situations. So from a systems point of view, we do have sort of a variation from simple, complicated and complex. And the ways of thinking about them have to differ. And so starting with a complex system, it's one where you really cannot understand the whole thing, how it works, because you can look at the individual bits, but actually how they work together and how they behave brings something different to them. And it's, so there are different phrases, a whole being different to some of the parts, a whole being better than some of the parts. But essentially you're looking at, you can't just look at the parts and think how they're going to work together. And if you're involving people, when people have choice and agency and have mood swings and have priorities and pressures, it's very difficult to predict the behavior of a complex system. And the origin of the word complex comes from the Latin word complexus, which means to intertwine completely. And if something's really intertwined, then it's very difficult to understand it in its entirety. And it's not just the system itself, it's its interaction with its environment. And going back to the stream metaphor, you've got this ever-changing nature of both the water, the stream, the surroundings. Just looking at the news today, you can see there's a big issue around the River Wye and the impact on the River Wye and how it needs cleaning up after all the chicken farms all the way along the River Wye and stuff falling off the land into the rivers and polluting them. That's not new. Or was that predicted? Probably not. So actually trying to deal with things like that is very, very challenging, and that's the context we're in with Sprocket. Yes, the other one, and very much an engineering point of view, you could consider let's take something quite large, as we've just seen, people fly around the moon. There's launches of massive aircraft carriers. But actually the equipment in use is quite complicated, but it's not complex, because you can take it apart and repair it. It can be built. It might be massive, but you can take an aircraft carrier or a rocket by itself. It could be complex, but once it's in use and has people on it and it's actually taking some form of action, then it becomes complex. And we can try and find ways of making sure we ensure its proper use. But there's always feedback, there's always change, there's always surprises in how it's being used and what might happen, because it's very difficult to think through every single context that a socio-technical system, equipment in use by people, is going to meet. So thinking in terms of Sprocket and the two transitions, the education transition and hospital to community, what do you take a system to be? How would you describe a system? I'll take a few minutes to think, and then I might ask for some thoughts. Anyone want to volunteer a thought? Joe, yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. Right. Well, education systems are complex, right? So they've got I wonder where you were going to put the rules and regulations, because you mentioned that at some point, but not in your examples of systems. But you have what the DFE would say are what needs to happen around transitions, and then of course you have the schools themselves as a structure, which are again complex structures, and then you've got the parents and the individuals themselves, and they all have their own ways of being and needs and thinking about the system as well, that will influence how and what they do within that system of transition, is how I see it, but I might be wrong.
I totally agree with you. So in those three examples, it's the socio-technical one, the sort of where people are involved. That's the first one. The engineered systems are probably complicated. The socio-technical ones, as you say, are the complex ones. And part of those systems are the rules, the legislation, the processes, the auditing of how people work. But does everybody follow a process? Because the process might actually not meet every situation you encounter. So people actually will make local decisions sometimes to make a change, to improve, or to deal with something untoward. But they're part of that complex system, and that's part of what makes systems complex. So you're quite right. Jenny?
Thanks, Jeremy. I guess your question, what do we take a system to be? I guess there's something about what's the purpose of the system, or, you know, sort of what goal or function is it trying to achieve? And I know that's not always explicit, but I think usually a system does exist for something to happen or to achieve something. And I guess as you flagged, and as Joe just flagged, relationships and interactions and interconnected parts can make those systems work in different ways, and whether they actually achieve that function or that goal can be influenced, I guess, by the interactions that are happening. But yeah, there's something about it that systems are set up to do something or achieve something.
I agree. You're absolutely right. And this is where you have different perspectives. So if you look at the Sprocket context, we've got a number of organisations coming together. You have the young people themselves, their parents, caregivers, are viewing it from their point of view, and they will see a purpose. Then you're looking at those in the educational side of life. What do they take it to be? What do the social care see it as? What do the health people see it as? Because they all possibly have a different perspective on such a purpose. Now, a single organisation, its purpose will often be directed by those who are running it. But when you've got a collaboration like this with no sort of owner of the overall system, part of the challenge we're going to be going through is trying to understand this range of perspectives of the different stakeholders and try and reach an accommodation in the context of each of the transactions, each of the transmissions, of what actually is the purpose of this. What's the purpose of the educational transition? What should we be trying to achieve with it? And that's going to be part of the complexity we're dealing with in Sprocket, is to try and surface that to start off with. And that's what the one-to-one workshops and some of the discussions and the workshops are going to be leading to. to incorporate a relevant range of views into how we put the transitions together and lead to an improvement. Megan?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I guess, from my perspective, I think you have the processes and you have the structures, but what makes it a system is, in my mind, how all those things work together and the way they interact, because on their own, they might not be complex, they might be complicated, they might be complex in their own way, but the system aspect is how they all fit together to get to the end goal.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Thanks. Kate?
Yeah, it was just to add, I guess, just thinking about how culture and values sort of impact on the system and how they build over time. And I was thinking about different perspectives as to whether people think the system is broken or the system is working, and how that is sort of measured and from whose perspective, really.
Yeah, this is the challenge that we're going to have of trying to bring all this together so everybody can see these different perspectives and understand the points of view of other people. You're absolutely right. Catherine?
Hi, so I was just going to say that sometimes we don't often get to measure some of the systems that we think we've mapped everything, but systems sort of happen sometimes without us knowing about them as well, within socio-technical context. And I find sometimes you're halfway through a project and you suddenly realize there's this whole other loop that's happening that you've somehow spotted by accident. I'm not sure how that helps us or doesn't help us. And sorry, I was halfway through walking the dog, but he wouldn't go home, so we've decided to sit in the park and take the workshop.
Oh, fabulous. Oh, sharing the sunshine with us. That's great.
There we go.
There you're absolutely right. Well, you've had to change what you're doing. Your system of walking actually has been adapted to suit. And as I mentioned, we will make improvements to these transitions, but we still have to be prepared to monitor other things that might influence it and build into our improvements how we then adjust to maintain the improvement in a changing context. So we are very much dealing with some seriously complex situations, and we just do the best we can to try and incorporate and gain as much insight as we can in terms of building a way forward and developing or co-creating the solutions to this. So coming back to the improvement, I've taken this from there because it's a nice summary of might take a system to be. They are elements of them are designed to fulfill specific functions, but when you bring multiple bits together, and I know one of you mentioned that, then how they work together and whether they actually can continue to work all their original need, or whether they get adapted to try and make a best fit in a changing context, is part of the complexity we've got. So yes, we will be using equipment, but it's more about the people involved and the multiple perspectives, and many of you have mentioned that. And as we're saying there, the description of such a system, we have to describe not just the elements or people involved, but the interfaces, both within the boundary of the transitions, but also how they interact beyond the boundary of the transitions. Because for each of the organizations involved, and that includes the families and the young people, they're also part of other systems. And it's the intersection of those that come together around the transitions. And then we have to be mindful of those when we're trying to understand as best we can the system. So within Sprocket, this is really what we take a system to be. Part of it is a way of organizing our thoughts. And our starting point, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is to try and understand everybody's point of view, that all of us actually recognize what's inside the boundary, what's within it. We can talk about a health system or an education system or whatever, but we probably have our own personal mental model of what we would consider inside the boundary of that system. And what we have to do is have a conversation through dialogue, gain some accommodation or agreement of what we're going to take each of the transitions to be in terms of the system. But as you've mentioned, all the elements, they have to work together to achieve the transformations. And just some examples here of what has to come together is the people and organizations, the relevant regulations and processes. I think it's Joe who mentioned, well, where do regulations and rules come in? Well, part of our stakeholder set is going to be those who are developing the centre reforms at the government level, and they're setting the funding that's available and what the criteria are for availability, because that's part of the structure which will be affecting the scope of the transitions, the transformations that we're talking about, the transitions. So do we have the ability to influence those? And we've got a way of thinking about that later on to try and recognise what we think it is. The various policies at play through the health environment, the school environment, the local authorities, social care, social services, and so on. And if there's any equipment involved as well, I think it's quite a lot of equipment necessary for many young people. And is it available? Is it sufficient? Is it fit for purpose, etc.? And I've mentioned just now that each system sits inside a larger context out with the scope of each of the transitions. And we'll also talk about what a systems approach might be. It's another term we often hear. And really, it's what we're trying to do as best we can is to gain some insight or understanding into the complex context that we're talking about, the complexity around the transitions. And I'm deliberately not using the word solving, because we'll never solve them, but you might resolve them for a point in time. And we have to build the adaptability and sustainability into that as best that we can. Recognizing the multi and interdisciplinarity of this, bringing all the relevant perspectives together, but also within those perspectives, trying to understand people's motivations and priorities, because we also need to understand where these transitions sit within the various stakeholders. Are they resourced? Are they actually, is it part of the job description? Is it a high enough priority for them to give it the due time? And we have to be able to, whatever it is, we need to understand it, because some of the improvement may be leading to try and change priorities, and we need to understand the motivations of those. Importantly, I know a number of you have mentioned the fact it is the relationships between the elements. It's the interconnection of interdependent or of independent elements, and each of those have their own autonomy. Nobody can tell them what to do in this context. Really, it's the collaboration and co-creation and coming together and recognizing the contribution of each and the importance of that contribution, so that people will choose to actually work in an improved way to improve the transitions. It does recognize the ongoing flux and change in life. We have to deal with that. That's actually a critical part of the transitions we're talking about, to the changing nature of need. But there's also the changing technology outside it and other pressures. The impact we've got of people like Trump, which you wouldn't think America's going to influence it, but through his actions, that's going to come back and influence us. We have to be able to cope with those changes and recognize the arrangements, relationships, and interaction. They're all part and parcel of this complex nature. A number of you have already mentioned that and recognized that. Do we actually see the world in the same way? Have conversations with other people surprised you when they've asserted something or made a comment? You go, wow, where did that come from? I'm not sure I quite agree. And yes, we have arguments and disagreements. So I think that really confirms the fact we don't see the world the same way. We all have what we call mental models. They're either implicit or they might be quite explicit. And then it's those that guide our action. It's that internal voice that we have, which we use to explain cause and effect from our own perspective. And we're constantly seeking meaning for why things happen to us or what's going on around us. But there's often an internal dialogue within each of us. And we use that, and that helps us decide what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, how good the football game was at the weekend, or what the weather was like, or whether your young people should do this or that, and why they complain when you say you can't do this. We've all got different mental models. And the importance of what is important and what's not. And again, when we look at the SPROCKET stakeholders, it's possibly some of it be the mental models of what's right, what's working well, and what's not working well. It may be more explicit, but then trying to understand those differences when there's this isn't right, it's taking too long. From someone else's point of view, they may be working as fast as they can within their workload, within their priorities. But if there's no conversation or dialogue between them two, you've got these different mental models of what good could be. And these mental models themselves, they form the system, they guide our behavior. It's part of the structure that's internal within us that actually leads to the behaviors. And we need, in a way, to understand our own mental models and try and understand the mental models of others. And so we can use them to make sense of the system, certainly in complex systems. And that's what we're going to be looking to do. And that's the starting point of trying to build the shared understanding in Sprocket right at the very beginning, to understand the range of mental models and why people think the way they do. There's another way you may have come across this ladder of inference, which Chris Agiris and Peter Senge had actually put out there. And it's quite simple to think about, really. So if you look at the real world, the world's going on and around us, and there's reality and facts going on there. We look into that. And based upon what interests us, our knowledge and experience and our beliefs, we then to notice certain things, and we'll experience them selectively based upon those. And our mental models will come to play of how we perceive the reality and facts. And we then interpret what it means of those bits that we select based upon our assumptions, because we just apply them automatically, often without actually acknowledging what our assumptions are. And we draw conclusions on those. And we develop beliefs based on those, and we take actions that seem right because they're based on what we believe. So this is often when you are talking with someone, they come at a completely different point of view, but you can either say, well, that's rubbish, you just don't know what you're talking about. Or you go, that's interesting. Why do you think that? What's the basis? I don't quite understand where you're coming from, because I see it this way. Because is that not? Well, we don't all see it the same way. So if you can engender that conversation and just explore in a non-controversial way, in an open and inquiring way, well, how is it you think that way? Where did you come from for that? What is it that you're basing your thinking on? What you're doing is actually trying to walk down the ladder here to try and understand the beliefs, assumptions, interpretation that's going on there. And the importance of this is because if you don't, then often it's just that a reflexive loop, that it's a continual development or reinforcement of your beliefs. And what we look for in terms of the data we select is based upon their experience of taking those actions and what we feel is right. And in the complex situation we're in here, as well as me, it's quite good. I try and do this with my children quite often. Try and do this with my wife, and we have very good open conversation why we think the way we think. Why is that? And in terms of reducing tension and confrontation, even with children, is really helpful to go, so where are you coming from? Why are you thinking that? Can I explain how it is from my point of view? I don't know if you agree with that, but this is how I'm seeing it, and it can actually be quite helpful. But more importantly, in the case of Sprocket, it's very important to do so. So let's look at this from a different point of view. Each of us, every stakeholder, we've developed our own predispositions, preconceptions, and prejudices. And they're constantly changing through life. So when we see the world going on around us, we've got this contextual reasoning going on in our minds the whole time. Where do I think I am? Where do I want to be? What have I got to do? Does this, what's going on out there, make life better, worse? Do I need to do anything? And that influences us and our predispositions, preconceptions, and prejudices. So this is going on all the time. That's how we go through life. We are thinking about, is that right for me? Where do I want to be? What have I got to do? Where am I? So when we've got a problem context, we then explore that exactly the same way, often from our own perspective. So each of the stakeholders, in doing what they're doing, they're going to be looking at each of these transitions and looking at it from their point of view. And so when they come into act, what they're thinking of is, well, what are my needs, or what do I desire to happen? What information I've got, and more importantly, what can I do? So in terms of what I have to do, each of us have a repertoire of actions. And this is, again, the thought process, which will often be happening individually around the stakeholders. And then based upon that contextual reasoning, we'll take action. If we can understand the needs of others, if we can get some insight into their needs and desires, it might give some insight as to why they might act, how they might act, and possibly we can, through a conversation, we can influence it. The information we can provide can help people understand the actions of others and how we can then perhaps better coordinate and collaborate. And the repertoire of actions is an important one, because one of the things we need to find within Sprocket is, do all the current stakeholders we've got, do we have the actions necessary to achieve the improvement to the transformations? Is there somebody there, at least somebody amongst all the stakeholders, who can do what we need to do? But behind this, we can go into more detail later on, is that with our repertoire of actions, that isn't constant. It can change based upon what constraints are put upon us, but also the strength of motivation. And if we're really motivated, we might do things, either break the restraints or do things we wouldn't normally do because of frustration or the absolute drive to achieve something. So this repertoire of actions is something that we will be wanting to explore.
Jeremy, I just have a quick question before you go on. Sorry, when you say repertoire of actions, are we talking really about like skills and knowledge, or are you talking about like habits people have?
All of them, Megan. It's so if you think of, we're going to look at this a bit later on with one of the methods. It may be that, yeah, when you're happy and moving along, yes, you've got the skills to do things, you're going about your daily life, you do what's expected of you socially, what the business requires of you, you fill in your timesheets if you're one of the stakeholders, you put your reports together, you follow the right procedures and processes. Now, it may be that if you're under serious pressure, you might actually skip something. You might not follow a process fully, or you might feel the process doesn't meet this particular context. So you might do something outside the process, but because you believe it's necessary to do it to achieve the improvement or to provide the service or to deal with the person in front of you for the best of your ability for their needs. So the repertoire of actions you've got is going to be, the means you've got is going to be your skills, and whether habits is in there. But whether you apply them and how you apply them is really what I'm talking about, the repertoire of actions. If you look at...
To fulfill your role in whatever the process is that you're doing.
That's right. But again, if you, and you could be a professional here, if you feel that there's a need in front of you that's outside the current process, or potentially you believe you're that motivated, you have to do something, well, actually could be bending a rule somewhere, you'll do something that you would normally do. So your repertoire of actions will actually be outside what's normally acceptable to try and achieve that result that you wish to have for the person you're treating, or what have you. So you might bend the rules for certain situations because the rules can't cover every situation. Let's take another example outside Sprocket, but you're looking, a lot of people are very upset with the use of British bases, so they're starting to protest. Now, some of those are going to get them into trouble, and you can think of other situations. There's going to be a lot of frustration from parents. Is, you know, their repertoire of actions is, what can a parent do with the SEND reforms? You know, and that actually has often led to changes in the proposed legislation or regulation as a result of people coming back and actually being quite vociferous in their response to what they perceive as something that is unfair and not right. So they may do things that could be potentially illegal, but they feel strongly enough that they'll go and do that. And that's what I mean by the sort of repertoire of actions that's constantly changing according to their motivation, the means they have available, and the sort of the rules or the constraints within which they're working. And in a way, that's all sitting under this contextual reasoning, a very simple diagram, but actually, hopefully it conveys quite a complexity. And every single stakeholder is coming from their own point of view, either organisationally or personally. And part of what we want to surface in our work in Sprocket is to understand the different stakeholders. And can we understand collectively each of the other stakeholders in the context of the transitions? So I hope that was a long answer to a good question.
No, thank you.
So what we're looking at is this sort of the observables. It's going back to the distinctions that we make, and we're thinking of systems again. So we take this nature of a system of people and elements and within this that's standing in some form of relationship or arrangement. And when we are gaining this shared understanding, what we want to have through conversational dialogue is, do we all agree with a set of elements and their relationship? And can we put a boundary around those? So when we're looking to develop an understanding of the educational transition or the hospital to community, is what's within that that'll make it work efficiently, effectively, and efficaciously, and leading to improvement. And we build that collaboratively, what we believe is inside the boundary. And once we know what's inside, we can then determine what's outside that. But it's coupled to it in a way that it's not part of the transition, but we need to be aware of it because there's an interaction with it, because they have this structural coupling between them. And once we've done that work and we can give it a label, we can then use that label, but all of us know actually what it comprises. We're trying to get away from that difference in mental model and try and gain as best we can a common mental model amongst the Sprocket community with all the stakeholders within it. And that's the importance of the one-to-ones and the workshops throughout the life cycle. We'll talk a bit about it later on and in subsequent talks. Of how we develop that and how we make this distinction, because agreeing the boundaries actually is quite challenging, because who has an interest in the transitions? Have we identified them all? What can they actually do? What agency have they got as they're part of that transition? And how do the transitions stand in relation to the wider context? And so it's building that understanding at the starting point. And one of the challenges, there's a lot of methods that can actually look at what's currently being done and do that incremental improvement, trying to do things better. But one of the questions we'll be looking at is, are we actually doing the right thing? Which is quite a difficult question to ask. And some of the techniques we're going to be using give us some conceptual thinking to help think about, according to our agreed purpose, what do we believe we need to do to achieve that purpose? And there's a simple technique I'll be covering in a minute to do that. And then when we identify the boundary, we're making choices. We're making choices about the scope of the system, what's inside it and outside it, what the boundary is and the wider interfaces. And part of the work we're doing in Sprocket is recognizing those interfaces, but then we're deciding how far do we incorporate our understanding and talk to other people. Or do we just make some assumptions or acknowledge any limitations? Because there's only so much we can do within Sprocket, but it's actually identifying those things we might want to seed other stakeholders to look at, because we may or may not have the scope to do that. All of this is based upon our needs, purpose, and perspective of the situation, and the values and beliefs within that, and the available information. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of dialogue and conversation, and the vital part is the work package 1 have been doing and are doing as work packages later on in terms of the co-creation, co-design. They're absolutely fundamental to Sprocket to embed this in the voices of children, young people, parents and caregivers, but recognizing the perspectives and motivations of the other stakeholders and agencies involved. One of the things we need to do, and is something else, is try and understand the depth of thinking we need to go through and think more three-dimensionally. A very simple model that Donella Meadows proposed years ago, and it's quite a helpful, I believe, a helpful model to use, is that of an iceberg. Although when I was working in Nigeria, they weren't quite sure what ice or icebergs were. So the metaphor there was the hippo's ears. So if you can see the hippo's ears, there's quite a lot underneath the water if all you can see is the ears. And there, so it's this thinking to depth, and that arrow with increasing leverage is more or less saying, if we want to have a sustainable change, we've got to work down into the depth. We can't just look at the individual events that's going on. So we can see stuff happening, And as I mentioned before, we've got these perspectives and motivations, assumptions that we individually bring. But it's quite helpful to start thinking about a pattern of events over time, the change over time, which is Nikki and Mehdi are bringing. We're bringing early on, but actually more later, and looking at the causality, perhaps, of what's been happening, trends, what changes, and looking at the cause of those might be the structures that are in place. They could be physical things. They could be organizations, rules, policies, regulations, culture, rituals, but also our ways of thinking our structures too. And that'll influence patterns. Underneath that is the mental models. And if we can start sharing our mental models and understanding how others are thinking and their thoughts and reasoning, this is the difference between the doing to and the doing with. If you do to, you change the deck chairs on the Titanic, you just deal with the events. You might put a new process in place and try and influence the pattern of behavior. But if you want sustainable change, it's actually working with people so they choose to change. They choose to improve. And that actually does require a lot of conversation and dialogue and thinking together for people to understand, I understand my contribution. I know I can see the benefit. What I thought was important actually is less important than this. Yes, I must change my behaviors. And then we build that back up again as a new way of working to improve the transitions. What I think is very difficult is actually to look at that sort of the underpinning container at the bottom she refers to, is that our personal framework of thought, our personal values and beliefs that are so core to us, sometimes group and society, often in that we don't see them in ourselves because we are who we are. It is us, but we can see them in others sometimes. And I don't totally agree with these words, because this is what Danello would say, is yes, you could address the symptoms of a single event. I don't believe you can forecast events, but you can probably gain some insight of, with our current modelling, we have an indication of what the future behaviour might be. And this is really the key work that Nikki has been doing and working with Mehdi with the causal loop models and system dynamics. And that's going to be very important later on through SPROCKET. Once we sort of started understanding some of the structures that are in place and some of the models they produce is actually modeling those structures. And if we've got this understanding of the underlying mental models, so we can start working at that sort of individual personal level to then start coming back to look at the structures. Are the structures right? How would those lead to the patterns? And by modeling and running models, we might see where we can adjust things to get improvements. Rather than playing with people and organization, let's try modeling them first and then putting some change in place and monitoring and assessing it. Can we get to this underlying level? I don't know. I don't know. I'd be fascinating if we can. It'd be nice to do so. I do have a sense that the team in Work Package 1 and many of you who are working closely with the communities we're with do this, do understand it. Has it been surfaced? Is it still a personal understanding? It'd be nice if we can capture that in some way, in an anonymized way, to understand perhaps personas and different types of culture mindset that's underneath all of this. How are we doing? So yeah, I'm going to take a break soon. And let me just one or two more things I want to do is, I mentioned structural coupling. And it's very much living systems. You know, we make connections with our environment. It's cold outside, we put the heating on. Price of fuel goes up, we may travel less. We're hungry, we eat, but the food we eat might have an effect on us. And it's very much recognizing that nothing stands alone. You know, if our environment changes, then we personally adjust. This is a structure agency thing. But then actually we might be able to influence a change in our environment. We can make choices to change our environment. And so it's a structural coupling. For anything that's living, it's structurally coupled to its environment. Biologically, this works, but also socially it works too. And I want to try and exemplify this in a simple diagram. Is that UK PLC, we personally are living in a context. So if we take that word system here, perhaps to represent the system of government that we've got in place, and the context is we're living in the country, subject to the government. And we take a particular context. We have the young people, we have, let's take the context of the educational transition, perhaps. There's a change in context here. Now, I think we're seeing it. There's more people who are requiring needs. There's increasing loading on the health system, social services. There's changing in finances. The situation is getting worse. The services are getting worse. Perhaps the support's taking longer. Forgive me if I'm incorrect, though. But then the government sees this and it goes, we've got to do something. So they might be making new SEND proposals. In fact, they are, because they're trying to account for these, the changes in context. So they make those changes and they see how the outcome of their interaction changes things. And then they see the context, how it's operating after that change. So if they bring in the new SEND regulations, does that improve things? You know, if they're changing the finance and the funding availability and the criteria for funding, does that improve things? So they then want to sense the outcome of that new interaction. Yeah, has it made things better? And decide, well, do we keep that change or do we need to adjust it? So the example here of the proposed SEND changes, the interaction was a lot of rejection or concern and response from the community, which might have gone back to the government, and they go, oh right, okay, we might need to adjust a few things, and then the interaction happens again and people respond to those changes, and the government then looks back, well, has that achieved it? Do we keep that change or do we discard it? Importantly, it's actually, does anybody keep a record of those decisions and changes? Time was, you had this notion of corporate memory. People remembered the conversations, but I think because the digital world we live in, it's more likely it goes into a file somewhere and people don't see it. They don't look at it again. They forget it's ever been done. But it'd be nice if that did happen. So then we come back and the context changes again. So they sense the change. Do they make vary things? Sensing the feedback and selecting what they keep or not. And basically, this has been and will be an ongoing change. This is part of that constant change of flux in life and the constant adaptation that's going on. There's just a very simplistic, trying to codify what we all know, but actually recognizing that when we're looking at the improvements in Sprocket, within the wide community we're working with, from government all the way down to individuals, this is the dance that's going on, what I call the dance of life. And it's important somewhere, certainly within Sprocket, that part of what we must do in our knowledge base is to keep and record the decisions that were made and the results of those, whether better or worse, and try and start maintaining this system memory, this sort of understanding of those changes over time and whether it was beneficial. This is built into the project as it is. This is part of what SPROCKET Hub and its ongoing guides can provide to the community, is become that sort of keeper of change and knowledge and be a focal point of expertise. Because you've got changing government, changing people in organisations, and the fact there is no single person who actually owns this, it's important to do so. So some thoughts to go on with. This is sort of the pause at the first part is, we can only see what we're prepared to see. Sounds a bit trite, but it's true. What we're prepared to open our mind to. Some may disagree with this, but actually analysis of data doesn't by itself produce ideas. It can tell you something, and this is the great AI debate, is does AI give ideas? Increasingly it might, but really it's working with the data it's learned, and we don't always know what that data is. But actually, analysis of that will often only enable you to select from existing ideas. So there's an important emphasis on hypotheses, speculation, and what ifs. What about? Could it be? What other data would we need to find to help us think about that and enable us to see the world differently? And that's the importance of this framework of possibility. It's a perceptual process. And that's the importance of communication and dialogue and sharing thoughts all the time. And I know the Sprocket leads are very keen to make sure that there's good communication between the work packages, that the work packages are not working individually. We've got great dialogue and conversation with our stakeholders and in the other PPIE and that whole approach, that we maintain those and we capture the knowledge we're gaining and make it available and adjust it as we go. So I'm going to suggest we take a break. So we take 10 minutes just to have a leg stretch, get a new cup of coffee and do what we need to do. And perhaps, well, let's start again at 11:15. That work? Yeah.
Just while we wait for people to come back, I was just thinking over the break, how do you deal with AI? Like, do you just, like, do you make it like an agent by itself? Do you know what I mean? Or do you embed it into a process? Or, because I could see in some ways it could be an actor all by itself in some instances, whereas other times it would be part of a process. Do you know what I mean?
That's a really good point, Megan. I think that, yeah, treating it as an actor by itself is a really good idea. It's not what I thought of that, because it's got its own experience and learning. It's been trained on data. It's quite insightful. It's got access to lots of stuff. It's going to be very valuable in places, but it's understanding how you use it, where you use it. So yeah, I think an actor in its own right is a great way of thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah. I was just thinking aloud because I was thinking about different areas where, in some instances, I could imagine like carers or like caregivers, parents, you know, using AI to try and make sense of all of the different things that they've got to do. And then in other instances, it can be making decisions in clinical or educational settings. You know, it's like, so sometimes it's like a co-pilot, like they call it, whereas other times it's more like, you know, the agentic AI is more like an independent agent. So yeah, I was just thinking it's quite interesting how it might change systems thinking over the course.
We have to. It's recognizing it's not infallible.
Yeah,
it has prejudices. It's not omnipotent, but it's harnessing it. I think, yes, rather than being in awe of it and subject to it. And that's a great way of thinking about it, Catherine. Actually, yes, as another stakeholder, as another agent, a very useful one, but one that needs to be used wisely, I think. Yes. Yeah.
Have you seen the latest BBC drama Capture?
No, I haven't.
Worth a look for AI. Worth a look.
Okay. I've noticed at
how AI might be used in future, or possibly is being used for all we know.
It's being used in many areas, some of them which really worry me, yes.
This one will worry you.
Just great, thanks.
No problem. Just thought I'd give you something else to worry about.
Thank you.
No problem. Anytime, got my number now. I'm just my input into the Sprocket project. Yogi balances it with calm joy, don't you, Yogs?
Oh, bless. What a fine fellow. Any comments at the moment before we just probably another half an hour to run? It's going to be a bit more interactive, something for you to think about and do when we start looking at some techniques. Any comments at the moment? Comments, concerns, or thoughts?
That's all great, Jeremy.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, agree.
Right.
Very thought-provoking, very helpful.
Yeah.
Good. It's something. It's an area we don't often think about, actually. I tend to think. So let's carry on. Systems approach in Sprocket. This will be a familiar diagram to you all. I think all we've done since we started is we've got a step 0, which we've introduced, which is actually developing that common and shared understanding as a basis of the work we're going to be doing. And in a way, if you look at it, compare it to the Cambridge systems engineering side of life, systems engineering, in a way, starts when you get round to probably... Say again?
Nothing, so I was speaking to someone else saying I needed to mute.
Okay, is when you get to about stage 6. And really all we're doing, for those of you who know the systems engineering and certainly the systems engineering V model, the top left, the starting point in systems engineering is understand your requirements. Well, really what we're fleshing out a lot is understanding what the requirements are. So in a way, steps 1 to 6 are almost understanding the requirement, and then we're going into the co-design for innovations, which we then implement, but not necessarily to the full extent that the Cambridge Systems Engineering model is producing. So the system 0, the building a common shared understanding, is really going to talk about some simple tools, which I encourage you to go and play with after this, actually, and try them out in your own context, because I think they're quite helpful. And many apprentices I've worked with and others have done so. So, perceptions. What do you see in these images? I've tried to pick different ones to the normal ones.
Tree,
kind of,
bottom one.
The tree at the bottom
face.
one, yep.
Woman's face.
Yeah.
Or a face in the bottom one, yes.
Face one. Couple of faces and like a time jar or jar on the top one.
Yeah, vase, what have you. I mean, you've probably come across some of these before, but yes. And there's one or two I was looking for some new ones where I could only see one perspective. I thought, well, what am I missing? So it's really quite interesting for some of them. So why do we want to build this common and shared understanding? Well, you probably know why, because I've been talking about it quite a lot. We have to recognize that our own viewpoint is one of many viewpoints, because we've got different perspectives. And because we all sit in different contexts, each may hold well in the different context. So having different ways of expressing mental model is beneficial, hence why I'm bringing out a number of techniques, each of which looks at a mental model or a context from a different point of view. And they're designed to be used individually and collaboratively. And in these, it is actually important to not just accept necessarily what somebody else's point of view is, but actually to have that gentle inquiry. That's why I said appropriate and respectful challenge. You know, I'm not sure I agree with you, but let me try and understand where you're coming from. You know, not convince me, but try and explain. And you know, this is, but you've also got to be prepared to explain why you see things a certain way. And it's actually being open-minded to actually try and think through how somebody else sees it, even if you, as a starting point, disagree with it. It's actually being respectful to park your own thoughts and say, well, okay, let me try and understand where you're coming from. And then you can get a dialogue going. And then it's this trying to build a consensus through dialogue and conversation, or if not a consensus, at least an accommodation. And by that, I mean, I may not agree with you, but I won't disagree with you. So I'm happy to adopt it or include it, but I don't necessarily buy into it. But, you know, I'm not going to fight you on that. So a consensus and an accommodation. And that's important in Sprocket because we need to accommodate those to try and achieve these sort of improvements in these transitions. Even though we're going to embed it in the voices and needs of the young people and their parents and caregivers. But if we don't take time for this, what do you think the impact will be? Often it's disagreement or people going... Any thoughts on what would happen if you don't take time for this?
You could get disengagement, conflict, hopefully no fisticuffs.
But yes, absolutely, Kate, absolutely. Yeah, I think the important one is a disengagement. Fine, you don't listen to me if you don't. I don't agree with that. I'm not buying into it. I'm out of here. And in this context of Sprocket, because it is a collaboration of people choosing to work together for the benefit of young people with complex health needs, because there is no overall owner, we have to take people with us so they choose to actually work this better way. So some simple tools to use. You may have come across rich pictures in the past. And I know Christine can't wait to start drawing rich pictures. Because she, like, I'm being unfair. A lot of people say I can't draw, and certainly if you look at the wonderful work we've got from our artists, is a lot of people see this as a rich picture and think, well, I can't do that, so therefore I wouldn't want to do a rich picture. But actually, any sort of mark on a page using images and diagrams where possible is quite helpful, because there's quite a few words in this one. But what you're trying to do is get your thoughts on a page. And certainly when there's a group of you working together, you can use this as a jotting board of the conversation that you've had. And it doesn't have to be understood by others. It's just to remind you and prompt you of what you've talked about. I'm trying to put it down on a single page. And certainly working in a workshop context, I think whiteboards are great and getting people talking about it. And when somebody puts something up, it sparks a thought from someone else. And the benefit of using images or pictures is they can be interpreted differently. But also it opens up the other half of your mind. You've got the logical sort of side of your brain hemisphere, and you've got the creative side. And what using images and pictures for is actually starts bringing in the creative side of your mind. It's not opening it up. The other way I've used rich pictures is if you're having one-to-one conversations with people, and certainly different organizations where they might not necessarily share thoughts publicly, they might share personal thoughts. So what you can do with the rich picture is start building a collective view of all the one-to-one conversations, which actually anonymizes the points that are actually put down on that rich picture. And that's something that we hope to do so that we can then bring in to workshops this sort of aggregated rich picture of the points that have been raised, but they're very much anonymized, and enables us to then go forward and consider them and talk about them and bring in some issues which might not be mentioned in a workshop context. So we should be using some of these as we start going through the understanding phase. So that's one. The next one, which is quite helpful, is what Gareth Morgan in his book Imaginization, I should have a reference there, calls the pig model. And what we're doing here is not what does the pig think of all of those, but the other way around. From each of the stakeholders' point of view, what does the pig mean to them? What's their perspective on it? And what starting from the 12 o'clock, you're looking at farmers, then coming around to the 1, you're looking at vets, you've got a wolf, you've got a business person, you've got a chef, and you've got a young child, a mum. And so therefore you can imagine each one of them has a different perspective on the pig. It's a source of income for farmers, animal to be kept healthy, source of food, return investment ingredient. I could have put a butcher in there as well, or a cute story character. Yeah, my kids were certainly scarred. You may remember the film Babe. No, you probably don't, too young. But the film Babe was quite, well, they didn't eat bacon and eggs for a while and got very upset when I did. I'm more vegetarian now. But I think it's Wes Churchman who started saying system thinking begins when you stand in the shoes of another. And it's really trying to imagine what their interest or perspective is of each of our stakeholders. Yes, you can ask them, but if you can't ask them to start off with, it's trying to gain that sort of thought. What do I think they think of this? And so taking something like an education transition, we're starting to identify, well, who are the various stakeholders, whether the parents or the children, perhaps different from young people with complex health needs, policy developers, the EHCP teams, the SEND specialists, the health providers, and others. So what do you think their perspectives are? So just as an exercise, if you've got a pen and paper available, what do you think? What do you think the differing perspectives are for each one of those? Just take a few minutes to have a think about, to jot it down. So again, this is our starting point for trying to, stand in the shoes of others, to open our minds up to gain some insight into the different perspectives. I'll give you 3 or 4 minutes just to make some notes or have some thoughts of what other stakeholders and what you think their perspective might be. Is everyone happy to share any of their thinking? Just a couple of minutes. Jenny?
Yeah, happy to come in. I added a few. I added charities who try and represent collections of groups of people, voluntary sector provider groups. I added school leadership because I think sometimes the sort of culture of a school is set by the leadership team. I added transport services. We heard a bit about how important that is and the role that that plays, so not to be forgotten. So that was my question 1. And then question 2, I was thinking about education transition, and I was thinking that it's unlikely to mean sort of a single event. So sort of getting your primary school, moving from primary to secondary, which is, I think, in shorthand, how we're often describing it in Sprocket. And it's maybe more of a sort of, I've just written like long, messy journey that families have to navigate. The other thing I was thinking about is it's probably not just about access to the right, it's not just about getting a school or finding the right school setting, but also access to the right support. So a different school environment might change over time about the kind of support that you need. And I guess
which stakeholders were thinking those different perspectives? It's linking each of those to a stakeholder.
Yes, I guess. Well, I was thinking predominantly around the charities and VCS provider groups, I guess, were the groups I had on my mind. But I was thinking more broadly, I think most of these stakeholders probably wouldn't describe an education transition as a sort of set moment in time. And I was particularly thinking about that from the families and the charities perspectives, and I guess some of those VCS providers that often are plugging gaps where things aren't quite right. So yeah, a few thoughts that I scribbled.
Thanks, Jenny. Kate?
Hi, Jeremy. Yeah, my brain was going in a different direction, but I don't want to add in more complexity to what you've already discussed. I guess I was just thinking about sort of symbolic interactionism and what you were saying about how, you know, people come with their different perspectives. And I was thinking about the young person, particularly here, and how their perspective may very well be different depending on who actually they're speaking to and who they're sharing that perspective with. And that just adds another complication. You know, if they're sharing it with a friend, they might talk about things being boring, or, you know, someone else's responsibility might be different if they're talking to a school teacher, or, you know, different. So I guess it was just getting me to think about how we even ask these questions.
Great.
We're getting them to think about, because of course that just all changes. But it's important that we do try and understand, what perspective in relation to who and when. So sorry, not quite answering your question, but
but it's a really significant point you raised, because we'll be coming back to Work Package 1 to find how do we capture this. No, thank you. Michael.
Hi, thanks, Jeremy. I think a lot of it's down to your perspective on who's taking responsibility for managing the transition. So as a parent of a child with complex needs, I've certainly been through this, and I think it's easy to feel that the system, and by that I mean government or the LA EHCP team, is going to manage things and do everything for you. I think the reality is very different at the moment, and that parents have to do a lot themselves. So they see the transition as something that's very worrying as parents, and something that requires you to effectively own the process, even though I think in an ideal world it would be quite different, and you would just be a beneficiary of the process rather than someone who's having to drive it.
Thank you. Catherine?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it sort of builds on earlier comments about what's not here, say siblings or good friends, or even if they're part of something else, like an arts club, or something somewhere else where the child might express themselves very differently than when sitting in a GP surgery or part of a school send team. So I think trying to help the young person feel able to communicate in a way that's it's quite scary when there's lots of adults making decisions around you, isn't it? You're just somehow part of it. So and I think school transitions are often about where your friends are going, and I could imagine
So
where are your
Melly,
friends
hope you're
going?
taking notes, because we need to build this into the protocol and come back and talk Work Package 1 about we start capturing these perspectives. So that's great. Thank you, Catherine. Megan.
Well, yeah, I'm speaking from actually Work Package 1, and whilst I'm thinking about this and kind of building on what Kate said, is actually when I'm reading the words education transition as a term, it sounds almost like transactional from one thing to another, like you transition from standing to sitting, and it's just two different states. And I'm just thinking that when we need to describe this to our PPIE panels and our workshops and other people as well, everybody on this list, it's actually not an education transition. It's like the process of getting the quote unquote right education and support for the child or young person. And that feels like, I don't know, that term just is much more encompassing of what the whole thing is rather than just a transition, I guess. That's just my thought. So when I'm going to be describing this, I think I will probably not use that term, education transition.
Well, thank you for raising it, because this is expressing the importance of the words we use. So I put education transition down as a simple label. Well, the first thing you do is agree what actually is the PIC, what term, and what term we use is really important. As I said, as you've just explained, the words you use lead to your perspective and the behavior you undertake. So that's why it's critically important that we start off by thinking, well, what goes in the middle? And you can have a number of different things according to different perspectives. And we have to explore these to see which one is, let alone how we're going to try and capture the points of view and the perspective. So no, thank you for your feedback there. That's really, really insightful. And for me, so you've got to forgive me that I'm new into this area, so I'm going to be quite naive in the things that I include and talk about. So that's one. Another one is thinking into putting these into the broader context. And we have something we call a context diagram, which we can use from 2 points of view. And it's about, again, exposing our mental models of what we think. And it can be used from the point of view of what do we think is in the transition, and what it has to connect with in terms of influencing, and what are the constraints. So you're thinking of it as a system in of itself and build a collaborative view. But you can also use the same diagram to think about individuals and what their agency is. And what Michael said just now is really quite pertinent in this, because and I'll show you, it's what can they do, what can they influence, and what constrains their action. And it's very much, again, putting out on paper so you can talk about it, the different stakeholders from different people's points of view, and to understand both what individuals feel, but also when we're looking at improving transitions, do we have people with the capability to do things, enough people in there? And many people I've spoken to in the business world have, they've used this when they've been asked to do something they can do. Actually, I don't have the agency to do this. I need to be given more resources, more permission in a way, or I need to be connected to people. So they're quite simple diagrams. So the first one, where we're thinking about the system itself, is what do we think is within the system, whether it's, and I'm sorry, I'll continue to use the word education transition. What does that comprise? Then we can look at what are the wider systems that are structurally coupled that need to be connected to for the education transition to work. And then we can think about, in the context of education transition, what are the constraints? What's impacting on this being able to work properly? And then you've got those broader constraints that affect everything. So just really, I put a few points down there that they're not necessarily correct or complete. But if we're saying, within education transition to the system, we've got the EHCP process, and you've got clinical assessments. That's one thing. But it has to work with schools' educational provision or appeals, which is not part of the transition itself, but is structurally coupled to it. Possibly constrained by SEND policy, funding, and GP or health specialist availability. So within a workshop point of view, probably in a workshop point of view, is where we get people to actually sit and populate this. It's part of, again, this conversation of, is it in the middle one? Is it the next one out? Or is it constrained? So we, using post-its, we position them and being able to talk about what you think is in each of the lozenges, in each of the circles. So we start getting this visual reference to what we think the system might comprise and what it needs to work with and what we see the constraints are. Because again, different perspectives will see things differently. I'm mindful of time, so what I won't probably do at the moment is actually again set you to think about what you would add to this. But it's something we will be looking at in the understanding stages when we start coming together. So if you have any thoughts, it'd be lovely for you to make a note and send them in via Anna so we can actually incorporate them. But it's something we will start collecting later on. But looking at it from a stakeholder perspective, what we're looking at here differs, because what we're looking at is from each of the stakeholders' point of view, what can they do without recourse to anyone else? What are they empowered to do? What's under their control? Then thinking about who or what can they influence? They can't control it, but they have influence over it. And from each of them, in terms of the actions they can take, what's outside their control and influence? So it actually constrains them. And then the wider environment is sort of the general constraints that influence everything. And when we're thinking about improvements, what we will also be considering for each of the stakeholders is, does this require changing? Do they need to be given authority to do more things? Do we need to give them the opportunity or connect them to people so they can influence them? I've had some very interesting projects where I come from a military background as well, and teaching engineers, where people with complex program management suddenly recognize they actually have very little control themselves. They rely on influencing things to get done, and have some constraints. So some of the changes we can make is moving these factors so people are given control, or they're connected so they can influence, or we try and move some of the constraints into being influenceable. So again, forgive me, this is my perspective, and an ill-informed one of, if we looked at it from a parent perspective, I don't know what you think, Michael. I'm looking at some of the processes that's been looked at so far. I'm thinking that a parent can apply, request permission to apply. You can research schools, you can request a school place, you can complete application forms, and you can appeal. Is there anything else that a parent has agency over? Can you influence anything? Don't know. Are you constrained by process, criteria, funding, EHCPs themselves, clinical reports? And as an example, over education reform, those apply to many, many things, not just the transition. So either have a quick think about now for a few minutes, or perhaps come back with points later on. We will be trying to explore this, to capture this from various parents, certainly in the workshops or what have you. You know, what would you add to this? I'm not going to dwell on that now because I'm mindful of time, but also you could then compare that to another example, perhaps a GP perspective. So yes, the GP or the health provider can conduct assessments, perhaps. I think I might be wrong from a GP point of view, but they write reports. May be able to influence the EHCP itself, and they certainly attend and can influence multidisciplinary meetings, I think. But likewise, they're still constrained by the EHCP process and criteria, funding, but also clinical workload and priorities. Again, the standing one for all of them is going to be education reform. So working from the PIG model, a multi-perspective approach for each of those stakeholders, you can actually construct a context diagram for each one of them. And then you can do the comparison. Does everybody have the same point of view? You might get stakeholders of similar type actually disagreeing necessarily of what they can do, what they can influence, and so on. So it's all, again, we're still trying to build this shared understanding. And then across the community, we would share these with everybody so they can see others' perspective. So when there's that sort of perspective of, well, harumph, things aren't working the way I want them to work, and that could be from a school SEND specialist, perhaps interacting with the HCP. I don't know. I don't understand it. Forgive me. But when they can understand what agency people have got, what they can influence, and how they perceive what they can do, and how they perceive the constraints, and so on, it's quite enlightening for others to see that, and to help them better understand the perspective of others. But also, when we're looking at transitions, do we need to try and change some of these? So people are given more authority in places. They are connected and involved so they can influence. And can we mitigate some of the constraints, for example? So again, perhaps something after the event to have a think about, what might you add to this? So I'll leave that one with you. I was planning to spend some time giving you a chance to think about it, but you've got the slides, you've got access to the slides, but just leave you to have a think about it. So I want to look at one more or two more things, actually. One I'm going to go through quite quickly just to introduce it, but not dwell on it, because I want to stay on the last one. So again, we talked about, you know, trying to think down to some of these deeper structures. Some of these deeper structures down here. One way of thinking that is generating cognitive maps. And what I mean by that is, get rid of that, so I want to, let me build a simple example. Anybody who's had work done or been involved in building projects, you can look, say, the impact of a factor. Wet weather could stop work, create damage, create accidents. Those might lead to delays, project cost increasing. That damage might lead to rework and repair. The delays might increase vulnerability. What I'm conveying here is what I see as very unstructured relationships. I'm not exploring the lines themselves. I'm just trying to build a picture of what I think so I can talk it through with other people. A guy called Miller wrote a paper called The Magic Number 7 ± 2. And in that is saying we can only hold about 7 factors in our mind at any one time. So when you're starting to try and to represent the complexity of what you're thinking, drawing it out and using it as a basis of conversation with other people is a way of expressing a mental model of how you see factors related to each other. But Colin Eden actually developed it a stage further, Eden and Ackerman. When you started building this out, they would say, well, from a very unstructured, what you're basically perceiving in your mind is when you start looking at where the errors come from, those are potential sources or causes of problems. And when you look at something where errors are predominantly going in, they may give you an idea of what the outcome or the end effect is. So it's very early thinking of perhaps building up a picture of individually from a mental model point of view of what people are thinking and expressing it. And that can then start leading into perhaps some of the causal loop modeling and going into some of the more system dynamics work. I'll talk to Nikki about this later on. So I tried putting one together. Basically, what I've done this in various projects is working from people's stories. So some of the preparatory work done within Sprocket, I went and looked at one of the stories in SharePoint and tried pulling out of that story some of those factors and my perspective of how I thought they linked. And you're starting to look at the impact and potential outcome of some of those. So it's uninformed and incomplete. But it's trying to take somebody's story, which has got lots of words, and trying to just identify the factors and put them in relation to each other. Not evidence-based, but what appears to come out of the conversations. And this may, I think, Eden and Ackerman have done it in their cognitive mapping from interviews and dialogues and conversation with individual people. They build this and take it back to say, does this represent how you perceive a situation? So this again is quite powerful. It's another way of taking, potentially a long story or an interview and putting it down into a diagram form on one piece of paper that seems to have those factors. And it gives you a chance to actually say, well, do we have data? Can we actually look into any of these? And what do those lines represent? How do they work? And it gives us an idea, again, trying to build the understanding before we're looking to make decisions of, can we understand some of the dynamics at play in here? Some of the factors being experienced and how they might be leading to, in this one, I think, in that story, one of the parents actually ended up with a heart attack as a result of the stress, which again had that adverse impact. And so you're bringing together the involvement of different people and how it comes together from a person's perspective and how they're perceiving from their point of view. So that's something to think of. They're a little more complex to put together, but there's nothing wrong. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It's just trying to represent thoughts and trying to capture them and then use them as a basis of conversation. And you can then add into it in a workshop context. But the one I want to finish with is very much this one, where we're actually moving towards options. So what we've had is what I call dialogue to consensus. So we've thought through the PIG model of, well, who are the stakeholders and what is their purpose? What's their perspective? What's their focus? Who are the stakeholders and what should their focus be, and what is it in the context of education transitions? And we recognize there's many different perspectives, motivations, priorities, and we've looked at those and ways, I suppose in a way there will be different perspectives, experience and professional roles. So each of the people will have a different view of how these transitions should be achieved. And we want to try and understand those, because if people don't have a chance to express them and share their thoughts, they won't be listening to others. So to get those out is a start of dialogue. And does anybody have any overall responsibility for the education transitions? Where does that lie, if anywhere? So what we use quite a lot is this question set I'll introduce, which actually has a simple set of 6 answers. The answer to question 1, there could be many different answers to question 1, and we want to capture them. And for each different answer to question 1, you have the remaining questions to start fleshing out these different perspectives. They're informed by the rich pictures, the multi-perspective diagrams, context diagrams, cognitive maps, conversations and interviews. And this is very much done on a one-to-one, or it's a good one for a workshop context. So we've heard it sort of starting to converge. So the first question we really ask is one we've all talked about: what's the purpose? What are we trying to achieve? What are they trying to achieve? And we need to think about, well, who are the they or the we that we're talking about? So for each of the 6 questions, you'll probably annotate, well, from whose perspective is this? And there will be different views, so that's fine. We don't say, no, you're wrong. No, we capture all of them. And then we use this. And the way this was done, this is leading into Chetland's soft systems methodology. He would use this as a basis of dialogue with people, different communities within an organization or a situation, to actually work through and see the various ranging answers to question 1 to gain these different insights. Because the next question that goes with that one, and these are surfacing mental models, of what do you think needs to get done to achieve it? A very simple example is, what do you think the purpose of a prison is? And it may be for punishment, it may be for rehabilitation, it may be for protecting society. Well, if you think about each of those being a different purpose, then what you think would need to be done to achieve that, it's going to be quite different. And again, even if people believe there's the same purpose, the same outcome we're trying to achieve, through different experience and knowledge and perspectives and beliefs, what they think needs to be done to achieve it will differ. And we're trying to capture this variety and incorporate that thinking and in conversation and dialogue and to talk them through. Then you're thinking, well, who are you doing this for? Who is this? Who's benefiting by this? Who needs to be satisfied or received? Because you need to make sure that you involve them so that they agree with it. It is seen by them as a benefit. And there's a subsidiary question is, what would your measure of success be then? That you have actually achieved that benefit for those people or that person. And again, like I say, you're looking for a singular answer to question 1. And you may have multiple questions 1 answers, but for each one of those, there might be multiple answers to question 2, 3, and the rest of them. An interesting one is, well, who's going to get these done? Well, you can go back to your context diagrams. Well, who has the agency to do this? Who is involved? Who are the stakeholders? How will they come together to do this? Do you have the ability to bring them together, to work together, to do this, to achieve the purpose? It's helping you think those through. This is a key one, is, well, who actually owns it? Who has overall control and responsibility? Who has expectations that need to be met? So they'd also have measures of success. And the interesting one with the transitions we're looking at is there may not be an answer to question 5. But that's one that's an interesting one to consider. And then question 6 of what constraints would actually apply. And you can go back to the context diagrams once you've completed those to pull those constraints in to see if they are related to the question 1. So questions 2 to 5 all refer to whichever answer you've got for your question 1. So again, if you take the 2 transitions, it's something you can ponder individually and again have a conversation and come back with. So what would your answers be? I'm afraid we haven't got time to sort of go through them now and then consider them, but I'd love to know your thoughts on this one. Answers on a postcard, please, but we will be coming back to this in time. So just to sort of finish off, and thanks, Nikki, for this, we've got a very pretty straightforward sort of conceptual framework. We're looking at, we need knowledge of the target, what we're trying to achieve. We need to understand the system and have knowledge of the system to achieve it, but also we need to know how we're going to transform the system to achieve the target. So we can look at the target knowledge, that's the steps 1 and 2, the system knowledge, building that shared understanding how activities are being done currently, map connections, populate quantitative models and so on, to give us an understanding of the system as it is perhaps. And then we've got to look at, well, how can we improve it with co-design and implementation to take the system we've currently got at the moment to achieve the target that we've got. And really finally then, just to say, would love to know, again, we've got the, as Anna will talk in a minute, love to know what you'd like to cover in future sessions. But I intend that we'll go a little more detail of our systems approach and the research protocol that Mary's currently working on with us. Look at the innovation pathway that I brought up to start off with and put a bit more detail around that. And then introduce some of the systems methods that we're going to be using. So that's the thoughts we've got, but those will be very much adjusted by what you think. Sigh of relief. Thank you for taking the time to sit through this. Anna.
Great, thank you very much, Jeremy. That was amazing. I just put now in the chat our feedback form. So just please take 2 minutes, click on it, and complete it now. It's only going to take 2 minutes. Just tell us what would you like for upcoming workshops, because as I said, this is the first of a series of workshops on system science and want to make it as relevant and useful to you as it can be. And I appreciate we are mainly UCL internal audience, but we do have some external people, so want to make sure that the content is appropriate for everyone. So please take a minute to respond to the survey, and thank you all for attending, and we'll do our best to share the slides at the very least, if not the recording of this session. Thank you.